You have me, the Monarch, and as always, my co-host, Mildra the Monk.
Hello.
Now, it's been a while since we sat down and actually constructed the bones of an anime, so we figured we'd do that again. This time, we're going to be building a mecha.
Why a mecha, you ask? Well, for one, mecha is a man's dream. And two, we are on the cusp of the beta launch of Mecha Break, along with a lot of people having a field day with things like Gundam GQX on the horizon, and just a renewed interest in giant stompy robots over the last year or so. Anyways, so why not tackle the idea of doing a mecha anime?
And as we all know, chicks dig giant robots.
You want to know what's funny about that? I now have a TTRPG in my library called that exact same thing, and it is exactly what you think it is.
Look, that may have been one of the greatest openings of any animated show. I love that song. Go watch Megas XLR, people. It's great.
Yeah. The thing about something like that, and why something like it can hold up as well as it can, is because you cannot do that level of parody of making fun of motifs in mecha and animation unless you're already a fan.
Yeah. That show clearly loved its subject matter.
I mean, they got Bruce Campbell to make a cameo, so as Magnanimous, which was a blatant MODOK parody.
And you know, it was just Bruce Campbell being Bruce Campbell.
Yes, I know that he has talked about retiring, but if I'm being honest, I treat actor retirements the way I treat wrestler retirements. You know, people say that they're retiring from the ring, and then you see them pop up on either indie shows or on various shows and various appearances.
Yeah. Before we started this, though, we have come in with a few some kind of ground rules for how we're going to build this Mecha Anime.
Mm-hmm.
The first, it's going to be a more fantasy style setting.
And the reason we chose that is, even with the glut of mecha anime that exist, and manga and video games and whatnot, a lot of them are still in the purview of science fiction and space opera, which is understandable. You are dealing with giant machines. I do think that there's fertile ground to be explored when it comes to the idea of fantasy mecha, because there's only been like maybe 4 or 5 major ones that have tried this. I know some people would say Evangelion. No, that is not fantasy. That is pulpy ass sci-fi.
Yeah.
5-star stories, maybe. Escaflowne, Knights and Magic, and Aura Battler Dunbine are the ones that come to mind.
I'd throw in Granbelm too, but that one was not good.
I've seen some people say Cross Ange, but I've also heard Cross Ange is really not good. But the point is that when it comes to mecha in a fantasy setting, it's very slim pickings, which means there's opportunities to mess around with the concept without stepping on anyone's toes.
Yeah, a couple other quick bullet points we had. We're going to have a kind of night theming to the mix.
The idea of going with knights is, for one, the elaborate process of a knight putting on their armor wouldn't be too far removed from suiting up in a mech. And two, there was an attempt to do an American take on Mazinger in comic form way back in the day, and it had the Mazinger as a knight. It didn't go anywhere, but the concept was present, and we've seen various fan arts and the like of people taking mecha and turning them into knight armor, essentially.
And our last point of note is the enemies of the anime are going to be your more fantastical beasts. We haven't exactly narrowed down what that will cover, but that'll be done over the course of this building of a show.
Yeah. So I think with this sort of thing, we should be starting broad and narrow things down. So the first thing that I think should be narrowed down is what style of fantasy we're going with. I think it's one that has to have its subgenre nailed down. And subgenres can be high fantasy like Lord of the Rings, low fantasy like Game of Thrones, sword and sorcery like Conan, and there's a bunch of variations within that. I have a few possibilities, but I'd like to know what kind you'd want to go to that is one that we can use, but also allows us to have the kind of mecha that we'd want.
I actually think it might first behoove us to decide what scale of mech are we going with here. We have anywhere from say about 4 or 5 times the size of that of an average person, all the way up to Gundam scale mechs.
And beyond that in some cases.
Yeah. I don't think we're gonna go Gurren Lagann. I don't think we want to go that far.
Absolutely not. I was thinking on the high end of things like the Imperator Clash Titans in Warhammer 40k, which don't or just on that kind of thing. But I would say the baseline size would be akin to Votoms, if we're going to be using a scale thing. Votoms from obviously Armored Trooper Votoms, or maybe the mech suits in Blue Gender is another case, or in Gasaraki. Basically, the ones that are one step above power armor in size, and that includes things like the armed slaves in Full Metal Panic. Like, they're certainly large. In terms of comparing it with other mech anime, they're on the shorter end of things.
So a lot of those shows I haven't seen, so I'm thinking it sounds somewhere similar in size to, say, Metal Skin Panic.
I'll use Titanfall as an example as well. The mechs in that are about 8.5 meters, according to their official material. And Votom's height, specifically the Scope Dog, which is the iconic mech in that, is about 3 meters.
So we're going to be talking something like house size, roughly? That's still a pretty big range right there, just saying about as big as a house, but...
We're talking about 10 to 12 feet.
Okay, yeah, so that'd be just a little bit bigger than what was in Metal Skin Panic. I think that's a good size to go with. In part, it gives us a big range of the kind of fantastical beasts you'd want to be able to work with. Because if we went, say, Gundam size and we wanted to, say, throw Minotaurs, just kick the Minotaur.
The big reason I wanted to go with that size is to showcase that these things are certainly powerful, but it's not a case where one of them could take out the kind of enemies they'd be put against by themselves.
Yeah, so we're gonna be building more like an actual team of these things to fight off whatever said threats are.
Yes, I think that would be a better use of the size difference. And yes, I am going with the idea that whatever they're up against is bigger or more numerous than they are.
Yeah. I certainly think it gives us a lot more room to play with the monsters, because again, you can have like Minotaurs on the smaller end, or if we're having teams of these robots, all the way up to fighting dragons in scale. All of that works perfectly fine with mechs of this size.
I think another thing is, in science fiction settings, you have to ask and answer the question of FTL travel, especially if you're doing a space opera where travel between planets is somewhat of an expectation. Because obviously, going from Earth to Mars using just standard power would take years. Hence why a lot of science fiction settings will have some sort of FTL means, whether it be warp travel in Star Trek and Star Wars, though in different forms, going into the warp in Warhammer 40k, and so on. It's a question that has to be answered. And in fantasy, one of the big questions that has to be answered is the presence of magic. How prevalent is it? How well understood is it? So on and so forth. This is where anime is in a unique position. Because with a lot of fantasy settings, magic is treated as this separate thing. But in a lot of storytelling motifs you see across East Asia, the line between magic and not and non-magic is not as clearly separated. Hence why you can have characters and ostensibly a magic anime like say Fairy Tail and have them be very martial in how they approach things. Actually, Fairy Tail is not the best example. A better example would be Slayers.
So that leaves the question, how magically powered do we want the suits to be? Because we could go the route, like, I don't know if I'd want to go it this way, but just as an example, the tech is being used to combat the magical aspects of whatever it is they're fighting.
If I'm being honest, I've kind of fallen out of favor when it comes to the magic versus technology motif.
Yeah, I'm with you there. That's just kind of the example of how far we could go with this one direction.
Yeah. The approach that I'd like to go with is much akin to the way we treat programming and treat computing, i.e., on some level, everybody knows how to use it, much like the way everybody knows how to use a phone or a cell phone or a computer nowadays. But in terms of how to make a program or how to modify a program or things like that, those things people are only know about if you're a specialist in that kind of thing.
So effectively, the suits are going to be heavily magical powered, but the tech is basically letting people who don't know how to do all this spell casting stuff still use the suits. Like, it's automating that part of the process for them.
Yeah. I guess to use another example, you know how to drive a car, but you probably don't know how to install new parts or install an engine or reprogram the internals of it.
Obviously, there's going to be levels of skill to how much a normal person can do, but yes.
I'm not sure if you drive stick or not, but it's a case of being able to do that or being able to drive creatively in the way that professional drivers do. Or to put it another way, people understanding the way it works and understanding the building blocks of how it works are two different things.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the form that magic takes, I would treat magic in a way not far removed from the Force, i.e., it's not a case where where you're only having to use specialized words if you're the equivalent of a programmer. If you're just using basic magic like just a spell to turn a light on, all you need is just the thought process and a gesture, and that's it. Things like magical focus is something of a badge of office for people who do understand the inner workings of it. But your average Joe doesn't need it. That's what I was thinking when it comes to how magic works for most people versus people who have it. Essentially, everybody on some small level has access to magic, but the level of understanding determines what you can actually do with it. For most people, what they can do with it is just interface with magic devices.
I can get behind that.
I would also go with the implication that a good amount of advancement has come from reverse engineering the mythical beasts that have been captured or taken out.
Yeah, so I'd say on the lower end of the mythical beasts, I said Minotaur before, so I'll just run with that for the time being. Something big and strong enough that your average human is not going to have the chance. Mm-hmm. But theoretically, even without all of these magical enhancements, maybe a group could have taken down a Minotaur or whatever other similar level strength of creatures, and from there started learning shit about their magic, how to make use of it. And eventually, they started getting to where the suits would be whenever this story starts, dealing with the really big threats of the world. Your hydras, dragons, whatever we decide to go with.
I would go on the idea that the earliest form of what would become mechs were just golems, which golems have their purpose. They're essentially the equivalent of robots. They have their advantages, but they're very simple. They can't really do much in the way of complex commands. Much in the same way a modern robot, even with all the advancements we've made, can't really do a whole lot of complex things.
Yeah.
Hell, it takes a lot of programming just to get a robot to fall properly.
Tuck the chin, robot. Tuck the chin.
I would say with time and advancements and understanding, making a more advanced type of golem that could be directly controlled was the next step. Essentially, the mecha in this case are a highly advanced homunculus shell, not full on organic, but just an evolution of what was made when it came to golems. Homunculus isn't the right word because that implies an artificial human, but it is that they are essentially more advanced golems made of different forms of metals instead of stone. And the reason I'd want to go with metals in this case is, stonework gave way eventually to metalwork in the advancement of primitive tech. So this is a parallel to that. As far as why doing something like that instead of doing the equivalent of, say, a tank, the approach I'd go with is that a tank needs a full crew and can't react as quickly. The things that it's targeting are going to be stronger and faster. And since a tank usually is going to be having a full crew, doing that would just create more problems. That's one of the go-tos I go with when it comes to, okay, why not just do a wheeled vehicle, because that's going to be better than a mecha. In this situation, a wheeled vehicle just would not have the reaction speed necessary. Speaking of that, when it comes to the piloting setup, should we do a traditional pilot seat, or should we do something akin to the mobile trace system that we saw in G Gundam or similar works?
Oh, G Gundam, that got silly. Either way, I want them to be in the mechs, just if only because the knight aspect suiting up the armor. It seems a little weird if they're not in the mix, just thematically, like
actually, I think
distance. So like G Gundam, like you move your arm, its arm moves, your legs move, its legs move.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see a need to get that involved. We're already gonna be having squads, so I don't think you need to double up per mech.
Yeah. Just for a bit of context for you, this is an example of this was a concept art example I'm sending you of the Jaeger cockpit from Pacific Rim, so you can kind of see where the method to the madness is. That's the basics on how this kind of thing would work. I know it'd be tempting to say that this is akin to power armor, but these are 9 feet tall, so it's too big to be counted as that. I do, however, think that there is a certain armor that people who are designated as pilots should have in order to maintain that whole idea of being a knight. Since that person is a knight, there's one other thing that I think that they should have, that anyone who's a pilot should have, and that's a squire. A squire, a page, that kind of thing. Basically, a directed apprentice / extra pair of hands.
I would say yes, based on how big we want like a squad here to be. If only because you do kind of run the risk of too many characters. I would say maybe keep it in squads of about 5, typical for the genre. I think that gives you enough room to have the squires as well, as kind of just minor players. And I could see a squad of 5 being able to take on some of the scarier threats as long as it's an elite squad.
I think a squad of 5 knights and 5 squires, that should be referred to as a banner. Because one of the things I'd like to keep with this sort of thing is the idea that there are certain orders, certain orders of knights. In this particular case, it's the fact that the different nations have their own associated knightly orders that are dedicated to the interests of their particular realm. I say nations, but it's more like massive. I'd say massive city states.
Yeah, because I think next we kind of got to narrow down. It's like, all right, how much of this world are the people, and how much of it are these fantastical monsters?
The approach that I'm thinking is the points of light motif that was in a lot of D&D 4th edition. Is where I first heard the term points of light. The idea that there's these individual civilized areas and the more untamed wilderness, which is where in something like D&D, that's where you'd in D&D 40, that's where you'd have the adventurers have their position. Going out into those untamed areas and bringing stuff back to the more safe areas.
So we're kind of playing with most of the world is not safe. It's probably very difficult to travel from one civilization to the other without these kind of armed guards.
I'm going with that. That there are two major roles that knights end up having. One of them is the ones that are more focused on defense. Actually, let me take that back. There's three sides of it. There's the protectors of the realm. The ones that are meant to be defense for a given settlement or defend it when monsters get too close. There's the traveling knights, which accompany merchant caravans essentially, and these merchant caravans are massive. It's not just a few carts; it's a few dozen carts that go between different civilizations. Have a few knights as armed escort, as well as plenty of on the ground mercenaries, because not every threat out there is going to be something that requires a knight. But having one around is a very good deterrent from, say, bandits. Is free knights. These are the ones that are going out on expeditions into the wilderness specifically to find things or fuck things up.
Deal with any kind of, say, more intelligent monster races that exist out in the wilds, your particular threats. Possibly even if there's a skirmish between nations, they might end up getting involved. I wouldn't want to play into that too early, though. Down the line, maybe, but for now, that's just a possibility that exists in the ether.
As a general rule, there's those three angles, and usually the most elite are going to be the defenders. I know it may sound like the ones who go out on the quote unquote expeditions are on the lowest rank of the total poll when it comes to the three, but it's more in terms of political standing more than anything else. But I do think our protagonist would be a group of free knights.
If only because that's going to give us the most room to play around with what they can and can't do, just in terms of the story.
I would say beyond that, the other reason to go with the free knights thing is so that you can have a variety of environments, because the other two types have to largely stay put. And I will note that certain orders, or actually instead of orders, I think houses might be a better term. Each of them named after their founder. Is that some of them favor a particular kind of duty more than others.
I'd see the houses, like, as a general rule, will have mechs kind of geared more towards one aspect or one thing. Not like they're all riding the same kind of mech, obviously.
Yeah, and it's not that everybody in it is a knight. I would say even the lowest end of knight has a certain degree of celebrity status among the populace. Not full on rock star, but you're given a bit of leeway, just because of the work that you do, because of the work that you're doing. So here's one thing I think is worth considering. A lot of fantasy mecha have it where the mechs are repurposed from old civilizations. Should we go with that, or do you think we should go with the idea that that all the nations can make mechs? They just take a lot of time.
Yeah, because with how we started this, it kind of sounds like the world evolved towards this. So I don't think the ancient civilization thing really works out here.
Which is fair. That's one thing that I think needs to be established.
Yeah. Which will mean each civilization is going to have some very unique aspects to their mechs compared to the others, but
I would also say that people who are just starting out will have more stock looking designs. Think, say, like the mass produced Gundams, the GMs, and as they get more experience and survive more stuff, they start customizing their which is a good way to help have a visual differentiation between somebody who's a relative newcomer, doesn't have a whole lot of experience but knows how to pilot a mech, versus somebody who's been in a lot of fights.
Like, and again, I think the house you're part of is gonna somewhat affect that. Like, for example, let's say we have a house that has like a theme around those, what do you call them? The rose bits, kind of the
Yeah,
floating.
pawns.
Maybe like those really small ones will have like the newcomers of that house in these next. We'll have like maybe one or two of those things floating around. Maybe they're just automated to a degree, so they don't have to worry about controlling them. But you start to get up to the higher echelons of the house, and maybe that guy's got like 5 different styles of those bitsies controlling along with his mech. Each one maybe having some kind of different weird elemental effect on it, like freezing shit, shocking, kind of stuff like that at the higher echelons.
I would say in regards to that, the common thread between individual knights of a given house is more about a preferred combat doctrine, much in the same way that there's a kind of combat doctrine preference with for instance Space Marine chapters in Warhammer 40k. The Imperial Fists like to really do siege combat quite a bit. The White Scars like to do hit and run tactics.
Yeah, I can get behind that.
And in that same vein, when it comes to the mythical beasts, which would be the opposing end of things, as tempting as it would be to have them be a full enemy unit, I would go along the idea that at some point there was some sort of rupture between dimensions and those things poured in. As far as why they keep coming in, no one quite knows. But it's generally understood that the line between wherever they come from and the world this takes place in is thinner in places. This allows for us to keep bringing things in without worrying about a particular type of monster getting wiped out.
Also, it does a lot to help eliminate the need to stick to like one particular theme. Like, I do think since we are going with the knights, there's going to be a lot of like your Arthurian, Eastern Europe style monsters involved here. Because again, it fits the theme quite well. But we can also start bringing in like all kinds of stuff at that point.
The other thing is I feel like the final rite of passage, the dubbing ceremony is something that there should be an equivalent of. The idea that you're given a certain name you're given a certain name as a title when you become a full knight.
The question is, how would we handle that right? Because I like the idea of including it.
While I'm thinking that someone who is a knight spends some time as a squire learning the ropes until said knight that the squire is studying under has decided, okay, now you're ready for actually taking the trial to become a full knight. And in doing that, instead of them building the mech, they are building the suit of armor that's their badge of office. And the reason that suit is important is because that's what actually interfaces with the actual mech. What do you think?
Yeah, I like it.
In the Now, when it comes to the monsters, I would say that there's multiple categories of them. Low grade ones would, as dismissive as this sounds, would be something like a minotaur.
Yeah.
Things that are certainly a threat, but it's not one that requires more than a squad to handle. In fact, a decent knight could handle it solo.
Yeah, that's like in my head, that's kind of the low echelon that I've been thinking throughout all of this. That's why I've used it as an example a few times. It's something you're not going to see a guy just get up and fight. But your mech suits are going to be able to deal with them like you would expect like a knight in a fantasy game to be able to deal with minotaurs.
Whereas a mid grade would require a full squad, a full banner. Whereas a higher grade might require multiple squads. And
Now, just because I don't think we need a reason to get too fancy in that regard, I'm entirely okay going with the classic, that high grade are your dragons and
Yeah.
other such creatures.
dragons, hydras,
Leviathan if we got in the water.
yeah, anything that's been in a kaiju movie in the last 70 years. Those are the things that would require multiple ones with different specializations. Now, in that particular regard, I do think anybody who has a propensity for actual spell casting would have a mech that can amplify that, so that they could use spells on a mech scale. But I also think that is a specialization on top of a specialization, so it's not something you're going to see all that
Yeah.
often. It's not rare, but it's not common either.
Yeah. Like your squad might have someone in it, or at least your banner has someone in it that specializes in it. At most, maybe 2. I'd say keep it to about 1.
It also presents the notion of having it that if the central characters see a whole banner of nothing but caster type mechs, that's going to be seen as special because that is almost unheard of.
Also, I think for like the really scary fights, having the one caster gives you a fun little game of protect the castle.
Yeah.
If you have to take some time to set up something really big, like actual circles, rituals.
When it comes to the mechs, I do think that there should be a kind of weight class setup with, because not every mech is going to be in that 10 to 12 feet tall kind of thing. I do think heavier ones are going to be inevitable. I think taking some notes from BattleTech would be the apropos way to do this. The light mechs are speedy boys, but they don't have all that much armor and they can't bring as many weapons. But they're very, very good for marking targets and for annoying the enemy.
Yeah.
Whereas the heavy ones, they can't do a whole lot of movement, but they have other advantages. Chief among them, they can bring bigger weapons, they can bring more weapons, and they can take more hit. And there's plenty of wiggle room in the middle when it comes to that.
So I'd say a general 4-class. You got your heavy, your mid-range, your light, your specialty. Your specialty are going to be the more heavily caster-focused types.
As far as and when it comes to the lights, most ones that you're going to see are in the medium category. The lights and heavies are going to be one's done because you have a particular style you want to do. Like an example of the heavy end of things would be, any graduate of the Troa Barton School of Combat, just accuracy by volume.
Heavy arms.
Or they take the approach of which is a heavy mech with jump jets, meaning it can do long jumps and likes to do death from above. In fact, it even has its own name for this kind of thing, the Highlander Burial, because it'll jump right on top of an opposing mech and bury it in the ground. And when the pilots first did that, what some pilots did was do that, then bring their mechs back, and then the engineers were like, we should probably stop you, but instead we're just going to up armor the legs so you can do it safely, because we can't stop you from doing it. And because of that, with this setup, you have a variety of different styles. Because I do think the protagonist that we'd have would essentially be a banner that is a bunch of rookie misfits. They have talent, but as far as the pecking order is concerned, they're on the lower end of things.
Now, for the protagonist, I'm actually going to suggest we go a bit of a route that I'm trying to think. Not a mech show, and I know other shows have done this, but kind of do a setup with like how Psychopaths had. Like season 1, your main character was one of the enforcers. Come the end of season 1, that whole story was effectively wrapped up. Second season saw Akane basically take over the role of lead character. That's kind of how I see this going, is we get that set up for season 1, we find out who the main character of this season is, we play out that story to its conclusion by the end of season 1. That way, if there's ever, say, a theoretical season 2, we got that story wrapped up, we've got a lot of world building, and we probably have a variety of characters that we can go, okay, this person can actually take the helm here as our new lead protagonist.
I would go with that, but I'd also go with a time skip. But i.e. between the two arcs, say 5 years have passed.
You could go that route.
Which allows, that's enough time to kind of reset the status quo in a sense.
I mean, you could also theoretically do a second season that's like happening just with a different banner around the same time frame. There's a lot of different ways you could go with that. But how we handle a season 2, I mean, that'd be up in the air if we ever decide to revisit.
Now, when it comes to the mobility of the mechs, I honestly think that their movement should be more akin to Gundam than, say, tanks with legs. Hence the reason for the interface and having a humanoid-like shape. It allows the mind to better comprehend the idea of moving around in that body.
By and large, yes. However, I do think it'd be interesting to have some people that might be working on like more grounded or say treadmill tank-like mechs.
You're thinking of Gun Tank, aren't you?
I don't know what Gun Tank is. Off the top of my head. I might know if I saw it.
Gun Tank was one of the 2 support mechs for Grandpa Gundam.
Yeah, I can see some stuff like that too. Honestly, I think since we do have that classification of your more specialty mechs, I could see possibly some people like just having like a main body mech, but their idea is they might be controlling multiple smaller ones. That wouldn't be like the normal course of somebody, but
there are such a thing as command tanks, so you have that going for you.
Yeah, well, by and large, I'm for that Gundam style movement. I do think we have room to include some of the others, just again as specialties, maybe at times older models.
Because with that kind of speed, it allows us to answer the whole why mechs kind of thing, and it's because they can react more quickly.
Yeah,
I would say the thing that gets the protagonist group more notice is taking out a monster that they should have been outclassed in. Like they were assigned to deal with a group of minotaurs, and then say a dragon shows up.
I wouldn't want to throw in a dragon that early that they dealt with if they're the highest class. But if we have like a group that's just basically they're saying, like, look, you're going to be dealing with stuff like the minotaurs and whatnot, and maybe they end up going out to deal with some of the minotaurs, and we have say maybe a chimera that was actually organizing these minotaurs for some reason.
Yeah. Like they expected maybe a dozen or so, yeah. And there's like 50.
Yeah, because if we're going with this first as that group of just the outcast rookies, I do want them to come across like they are rookies, but they do clearly have it in a take on stuff that people didn't expect. A dragon might be a bit much too early, but yeah, just a well-organized group of minotaurs that's either way bigger than was expected, or has one of those more middle-class monsters that might have a higher intelligence than a lot of your other lower-class ones. Something along those lines, I think, would be great.
Especially since that allows for a bit of distinction when they take it out. Because if they took out a dragon, nobody believed. Whereas if they take out a bunch of minotaurs outnumbered, that's going to gather a bit more attention. That's the way that I see it.
Now, I'd also think we'd want each one of our rookies from a different house, rather than bringing them all out in from the same one.
I think they have different backgrounds, but the houses aren't like noble houses. Like anybody can join a house if they're sufficiently qualified.
Well, this leaves the question: how many houses are going to exist in this one area Because I'm presuming we're not going to try to get too much into all the different points of light here, all the different civilizations.
I would say,
at least not early on.
In a given city-state, there's no less than 3 and no more than 8. But the amount of houses usually correlates to how large a particular place is.
Yeah, I still would say we wouldn't want everyone coming from the same house for a single banner, just because it gives us, if each house has like a specialty to a degree, like how they fight. I think it'd be a bit more interesting to have a bit more diversified. That said, if we say have 3 houses, a couple people from one house, a couple from another, one from a third, just as long as we got a good mix in there.
And in that regard, I would say the pipeline is you first get recruited, then you're spending some time in a group academy, then you're spending some time getting selected under as a squire. Before you become a full knight.
Now, on the excursions, would the squires go out with the knights when they leave the town?
Yes. A squire would be
Yeah.
kitted out the way a knight would be in a fantasy setting. It's just that because of the level of tech, there's magic enhanced melee and ranged weapons. The equivalent of like a rune sword or a rune rifle in some fantasy settings. Essentially, they are kitted out in the way that a soldier might be. Because as a squire, you do have some degree of combat training. You're a step above a standard soldier, but you're not quite at the level of a knight yet.
So I'd imagine they're mostly going to be there for support for the main combats.
Support, scouting, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the reason I do that is so that you can have, on the ground combat. Not every combat encounter needs to involve the mechs. And as far as how movement can go about, I'm honestly thinking that much in the same way that the monsters show up out of other dimensions, the knights are in their own pocket dimensions before they're called out. Because either that or they're in storage way up in the sky, whichever you prefer.
I would say with a threat of giant sky-faring creatures like dragons, that would not be a very good idea.
So, I think the pocket dimension storing would be the better way to go here.
Either pocket dimension or they're in a garage and then summoned to a given area. I would go with the notion that the further out you go, the longer it takes for it to be summoned. If you're within the city, it's less than a second. If you're a little bit further out, it takes time to charge up the summoning spell, which does provoke a bit of risk when it comes to going out and venturing. In my opinion, I do think that one of the big motifs I'd go with. See, the first arc would be the pipeline from going from heavily talented squires to respected knights. The second arc would be knights, those respected knights dealing with a major threat. I would say one approach to go with, since we've made a lot of Arthurian references here. Have some knights that are independent traders, essentially bandit kings, and those ones are black knights. The knights that have essentially broken their oaths and gone fully independent, but in doing so are wanted outlaws. Other knight houses absolutely hate black knights. Everybody else isn't too fond of them either because whenever they show up, shit gets fucked up.
Yeah.
But it's usually very easy to tell a black knight because they're heavily armed and their stuff is not in the best condition. It's in a workable condition. But that doesn't mean that they should be underestimated. If anything, if you're out in the wilderness for long amounts of time while being able to hold your own in a mech, you're likely not someone who should be underestimated. Yeah. And if it sounds like I'm going with the idea that a single black knight can hold their own against the whole banner, yes. Primarily because they know all the same tactics.
No, I think what we have so far is a really solid foundation for the world, how it functions, and a lot of the kind of the general rules of how things work laid out. How much do we want to get into the actual first arc of this story?
I think the broad strokes we already covered.
Yeah.
And when I say that they are misfits, what I mean by that is each of the individual members of the banner we'd be following are very skilled. But they have certain personality issues. One of them might be very good at combat, but is a bit of a hothead. Another might be very good at scouting, but has certain strange habits. That sort of thing.
Again, I think the good just opening arc, as you mentioned before, it's kind of them early on as a banner. They get that mission that just a squad this young probably shouldn't have been able to overcome, managed to do so. Notoriety builds from there.
And I do want to note that I wouldn't have it that they succeeded because of some hidden ability or something like that, but more out of just being pulling off crazy tactics that people think wouldn't work.
So what happens when you get a bunch of people that didn't belong in maybe any of the other squads for one reason or another? When they come together, it just kind of clicks for them.
I'd say one of the other things that highlights the whole misfit thing is each of them has some disciplinary record against them, whether it's legit or otherwise. It's maybe somebody got screwed over due to politics. Maybe somebody got in trouble for mouthing off. But none of them are saints. And because they're not saints, you can have them in these situations where even as knights, other knights look at them with the side eye. And by the time you get to the second arc, they're still looked at as a little crazy, but the fact that that crazy actually gets results is acknowledged.
Like, sometimes you just gotta respect the game.
What I mean as far as doing crazy things, it'd be a case of, say you have a scene where they're completely outnumbered and their approach is, fuck it, we ball, and just just getting close and throw hands. Not with any sort of melee weapon, because they've lost all of those, but in terms of just using mecha fisticuffs, i.e., treating a mech as if they're wrestling more than anything else. And I'd say the reason why that's not considered is because a lot of people have the idea of, well, if you damage the hand, then you can't use any melee weapons with that unless you get it fixed.
I don't know, how sharp are those remaining jagged edges? I've seen Hobo with a shotgun. I've seen someone stab someone to death with a bone stump. Same applies to a mech arm, I guess. Or
in one case, and this I had pulling back to older campaigns, I had designed one mech whose pilot was seen as this immortal, because no matter how many times people would shoot at him, he just wouldn't go down. Like, the only way to have him go down was to take out all of his legs, because he was, and even then he would just get out of the mech and fight on foot. Bring in that kind of crazy, because I could easily see the whole Minotaur thing of them being written off as killed in action, and then they walk right back to camp and just go, "I lived, bitch." Now they're beat all to hell, but everybody thought that everybody had already thought, "Oh, they're probably dead. We should bring in reinforcements."
By the time the reinforcement gets there, you've just got the banner still standing. Beat to hell, I imagine, but standing.
Either that, or a case of the reinforcements finally come, and they're like, "Oh, that's a lot of dead Minotaurs. Jesus, that's a lot of dead Minotaurs."
Yeah.
Jesus, what the fuck is that? What happened? And it's not like they survived unscathed and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's arms missing, legs missing. All the weapons are either they're out of ammo or damaged beyond repair. But as long as you've got 1 HP left, you're still in the fight. It's that kind of energy. In doing that, you can have them develop that reputation of being crazy.
Yeah.
I suppose if I were to use an example of what I mean of within a given organization, but are treated as the odd ones out, consider the G5 in One Piece.
Oh, the G5. I love
They're certainly good at their job, but they are far more loyal to Smoker than to the Navy as a whole.
Look, after Punk Hazard, I think they're more loyal to Sanji than Navy as a whole.
Possibly. The point is that they're in the world government's Navy, but they don't exactly follow procedure or chain of command.
I would say the nameless soldiers or Marines of the G5 are some of my favorite characters in One Piece. I think other than Smoker, have any of them been named? I think there's too many of them to name.
Well, there's Tashigi. But the point is that the point is with the G5 is that they are very much a reflection of Smoker himself. Even though he is an officer, he told the world government to go fuck themselves. I think that says it all, really.
But yes, I see what you mean.
Because that was an early thing where they wanted Smoker to get the credit for Arlong being taken out, but he was like, "I didn't fucking do it."
But yes.
But
I think that whole initial thing should only be like the initial 1 or 2 episodes where they make that initial just what the hell did you survive?
And I wouldn't want to have. I'm only using the G5 as an example of the relationship that they have within a greater organization. The approach is they will follow orders, but they won't exactly follow decorum. If they're tasked with doing a certain thing that goes with their personal oaths, they'll do it. But
it's getting done their way.
I'd say the tipping point is early on they end up using standard tactics. until they're put in a situation where standard tactics aren't going to work, so we need to do non-standard tactics.
Now, I think the approach for, like, because I've mentioned, like, I like a somewhat of a shifting protagonist, like this first arc, whoever it is that's going to be the leading protagonist, I would say is the one that kind of starts to pull the different crazies together.
Yeah, I would say that...
the de facto leader.
And truth be told, I'd say that the leader in the second arc is somebody who was kind of second fiddle early on, and had to take the role only because the original leader got killed.
Definitely possible.
Because I think a good way to make it stand out is that this banner was a group of 5 at first, of 5 knights, but unfortunately, actually, here's an even better approach. At first, we're not following the knights, we're following the squires. But the leader of the banner gets killed, and the other knights are indisposed. So our protagonist says, "Fuck it," gets in one of the empty mechs and decides to take charge. It still ends up getting him in trouble afterwards because he wasn't authorized to be in it. But even the people punishing him were like, You did nothing wrong, but technically we have to do this, so you're gonna be put in deep rig and then get 20 lashes afterwards, kind of thing. You know, i.e. you did the right thing, but you did technically do something unauthorized.
So I'd imagine that'd be then the premise of that very first season. They start to rise up. Said guy dies early on. Squire takes command, and that's kind of him setting himself in as this little group's leader. Simple story, a lot of fun things you can do with it, especially depending on how you build this little group of 5 people and their squires. And possibly, just to keep the whole thing tied together, let's just say we go with Chimera organized said Minotaurs at the beginning, and by the end of that first story, it's whoever was like organizing this surprise Minotaur army raid, whatever the goal was supposed to be, and whatever the reason, there is an unusual amount of Minotaurs there. So we could end with the same conflict that was at the start of it, effectively. Honestly, you could probably go the route with for some reason, the reason they kind of had an idea of how to fight a squad, or how to fight a banner, was because one of these Black Knights was involved with some weird mid-range mythical creature. That is, if we want to get a Black Knight involved that early.
I think with that, we've covered all the bases that we can. Can't think of any other spots we haven't addressed with this particular idea.
Yeah, and I don't think there's too much of a need to go deep in on each individual knight yet. Not at this stage, anyway. So, we have effectively built a great structure, I think, for what could be a really fun mecha fantasy anime. Now, by the time this episode goes up, we should be on our second episode of Valley of the Judged, covering Shroud of the Avatar, I believe?
Shroud of the Ancients.
Ancients, right. Shroud of the Avatar is a game. Or a video game.
Yeah, one that never came to pass.
That's a little sad. Yeah, so you can check us out then the Thursday after this goes up over on Mildra's Twitch and YouTube. And for next month on Adventures, let me double check the name of the director we're talking about, because I'm sure I will screw it up if I don't have it in front of my face. We'll be talking about director Mamoru Oshii.
Yeah, and the very interesting directions his filmography went through.
That's going to be an interesting one. But with that said, thank you all for coming by, and check us out for the next adventure.